Welcome to Conspiracy Deconstructed. Our focus today is on a phenomenon that really proves just how fragile truth can be, especially when it's confronted with, this sense of moral urgency and a compelling psychological theory. We are going deep on a concept that completely upended the American legal system. It dismantled families, and it created this decade-long moral panic, not just in the U.S., but internationally.
We're talking about the belief in repressed memories. This really profound and for a long time unquestioned idea that the human mind can just sequester memories of horrific trauma, especially trauma of an organized ritualistic nature. And not only that, but that these memories could be perfectly recovered years, even decades later, through certain kinds of therapy.
Right. And our mission here is to trace this belief from its pretty contentious origin story all the way through the shocking real-world fallout of what we now call the Satanic Panic. We're going to stick only to the academic research, the cognitive science, and the legal evidence to figure out exactly where the facts and the fabrication split apart. This is going to take us into the really tragic story of the McMartin Preschool Trial and then the aggressive backlash that followed the false memory syndrome movement. So to really get the intensity of the panic, you have to hear the conspiracy theory in its most terrifying form. The story that was pushed relentlessly through the 80s and early 90s was this. The truth, the terrifying truth, is that highly organized, secretive, satanic cults were operating completely undetected, all across the United States and even globally.
And this wasn't some, fringe idea. It became a mainstream cultural fear. It was treated like an immediate active threat to public safety.
So what were they supposedly doing?
Well, proponents were arguing these cults were engaged in these continuous intergenerational crimes on a massive scale. I mean, we were talking about activities so awful they just defy comprehension. The allegations routinely included things like human sacrifice, infanticide, cannibalism, child prostitution rings, organized torture, even grave desecration.
And the central claim, the thing that made it so terrifying, was that these crimes were being carried out by respected, powerful people in the community. Your teacher, your doctor, lawyers, even police officers.
Exactly. People who functioned completely under the radar and somehow left zero physical evidence behind.
So, okay, if there's no evidence, how does the story hold up? The public needed an explanation for this hidden horror. And the key to unlocking it all was in one psychological concept: memory.
Right. This organized abuse, which got the name Satanic Ritual Abuse, or SRA, was believed to be so severe, so fundamentally destructive to a child's mind, that the victims had no choice but to totally repress the memories. These horrific events were just locked away in the subconscious, completely inaccessible for years.
Or even decades. So these victims, they survived the trauma, but they carry this hidden psychological damage with them into adulthood.
And that damage was very frequently linked to a specific diagnosis: dissociative identity disorder, or DD.
Which people back then probably knew as multiple personality disorder, or MPD.
That's the one. And the theory became institutionalized in some therapy circles. The thinking was the abuse was so catastrophic that the personality actually fractured into different parts. And the perfect, pristine memories of the rituals, they resided only within those alternate personalities.
Wow. So to find the evidence of the crime, you just had to bring those alters forward in therapy.
That was the idea.
So that link is crucial. DD becomes the proof that the memory must be real and repressed.
It's a clinical feedback loop. SRA provided a neat explanation for the symptoms of DDD. If a patient was dissociative, it wasn't just, general trauma. It was structured, ritualistic trauma. And because the abuse was supposedly organized, the diagnosis itself was seen as proof that the cult existed.
And then the media just poured gasoline on the fire.
Oh, completely. The mid to late 80s were saturated with these sensationalist TV specials. I mean, think of Geraldo Rivera's infamous 2-hour special in 1987, Devil Worship, exposing Satan's underground.
I remember that.
That special claimed, and I'm quoting here, that estimates put over 1 million Satanists in the United States linked in a highly organized, secretive network.
It wasn't framed as a maybe. It was framed as a fact, an urgent reality.
Absolutely. So the hunt for these hidden cults, it didn't start in a police station with a cold case file.
No. It started in the quiet, confidential setting of a therapist's office.
Often using hypnosis or highly suggestive techniques.
And from there, it moved right into the courtroom, leading to these devastating high-stakes trials.
To really understand how this all took hold, we have to trace where the idea of recovered memory even came from. It provided the whole psychological infrastructure for the SRA claims. It's not, a brand new idea, but its resurgence in the late 20th century was very specific and very charged.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Where do we start? The whole debate seems to circle back to one person. We have to start with Sigmund Freud, don't we?
We do. The early roots rewind to the really contentious history of psychoanalysis. In 1977, a feminist writer named Florence Rush published a book, The Best Kept Secret, Sexual Abuse of Children. And then later, a scholar named Jeffrey Moussaieff Masson, in his 1984 book, The Assault on Truth, made a very similar argument. They both claimed that a huge historical error had happened, that Freud's shift from his initial seduction theory to the Oedipus complex was essentially a cover-up.
Okay, what was the seduction theory?
Well, initially back in the 1890s, Freud believed his female patients when they reported memories of childhood sexual abuse. That was his seduction theory. But he quickly abandoned it. He decided that these memories weren't actual events, but were imaginary, wishful, neurotic fantasies. The Oedipal wish.
Wow.
So Rush and Masson argued that by doing this, Freud was basically protecting the reputation of the Victorian patriarchy. He was actively denying the reality of widespread trauma that his patients had suffered.
So the argument being made in the 70s and 80s was that the father of modern psychoanalysis buried the truth about abuse. And that created this urgent mandate for a new generation of therapists to go out and reclaim that lost truth, to validate what victims were saying.
It provided the historical justification for digging for repressed memories. And that intellectual framework set the stage, especially within the feminist therapy movement. But the immediate explosive spark for the Satanic Panic itself, that was one specific sensational book, the 1980 publication of Michelle Remembers.
Right, co-written by a psychiatrist, Lawrence Pazder, and his patient, Michelle Smith.
Who he later married, by the way.
Of course. And Michelle Remembers was the bridge, wasn't it? It connected the idea of repressed childhood abuse directly to this modern, ongoing satanic conspiracy.
Precisely. The book was presented as a detailed, nonfiction autobiography, detailing horrific torture in these elaborate satanic rituals, starting when Michelle was just 5 years old. The events were supposedly recalled over hundreds of hours of therapy and hypnosis with Pazder.
And the claims were pretty out there.
Yeah, outlandish is the word. We're talking about rituals that took place over months, including her being forced to participate in human sacrifice.
And what was the explanation for the complete lack of physical evidence for these huge, prolonged crimes?
Well, the book provided a miraculous supernatural explanation. Michelle claimed that all the physical evidence of her torture, the wounds, the blood, was miraculously removed by Saint Mary and the Archangel Michael, who intervened to drive Satan away.
So right away, the claims are positioned outside of any normal forensic investigation.
Exactly, and the story was a massive success. It sold millions of copies and provided this horrifying but weirdly compelling template for all the SRA claims that came after.
But wait, I have to jump in. The book presented itself as fact. Was there ever any pushback or counterclaims?
Oh, absolutely. Later, when the panic was at its height, investigators looked into the claims in Michelle Remembers and found huge contradictions. Testimony from her own father and two sisters contradicted the memoir.
What about school records? Things like that.
That's the crucial part. Records showed a 1955 school yearbook photo of Michelle attending school, looking perfectly healthy, during a month when the book claimed she was held captive in a basement.
By the time that came out, the damage was done.
The damage was done. The book had already established the modern paradigm. Childhood abuse is often ritualistic, it is hidden by repression, and it can be recovered through therapy.
So the template was set by a book with a very shaky factual basis. But why then? Why did society in the 80s and 90s just devour this idea?
It was a perfect storm, really. Three powerful overlapping forces. First, you had this general moral and cultural fear.
The cult war.
The cult wars, exactly. Anxieties about new religious movements combined with this cultural anxiety about moral decline. And movies like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist had already put the image of occult evil operating just beneath the surface of respectable society into everyone's mind.
So the idea of organized evil wasn't new, but the idea that it was specifically targeting children and in places you trust, like daycares, that was the terrifying new piece.
And that's where the second factor comes in, social and legal shifts. You had the rise of politically powerful fundamentalist Christian groups, like the Moral Majority, and they were framing a lot of social problems, including child abuse, as part of a cosmic battle against evil. At the same time, the child protection field was growing. You had mandatory reporting laws. Public awareness of child abuse as a serious problem was way up.
So you've got the cultural fear, and now you have a legal and institutional structure demanding that you protect children from it. Everyone was looking for the worst possible enemy.
And then the third factor, therapeutic momentum. Concepts like PTSD, psychological trauma, they were becoming mainstream. It provided a clinical language for suffering.
Yeah.
And then you had these instructional psychology books, most famously The Courage to Heal in 1988.
That book was huge.
It was a kind of Bible for the movement. It explicitly instructed women and therapists on how to recover lost memories of abuse. And critically, it urged readers that if they even suspected they were abused, they probably were. And it told therapists to question clients aggressively about incest.
So you have cultural fear, legal urgency, and a therapeutic manual that basically greenlit the search for hidden memories.
It was the perfect convergence.
Okay, so let's pivot. Let's step into the mindset of someone who believed this. If you were convinced this horrifying conspiracy was real, what was the evidence you'd point to? Because proponents were very effective at presenting this unified, chilling case.
They were. And they often said that the sheer consistency, the volume, and the graphic detail of the stories coming out of therapy proved the conspiracy had to be real, even if you couldn't find a shred of physical evidence. Their case really rested on three pillars. First, the testimony of adults who recovered memories in therapy. Second, the really dramatic and bizarre testimony of children in those big daycare cases. And third, a very unique interpretation of the complete lack of forensic evidence.
Okay, let's start with pillar one. Adult recovered memories and DID. This was the clinical core of it all.
Right, and we already touched on this, but in the vast majority of these cases studies, put it at about 95%, the memories were not spontaneous. They were recovered during psychotherapy sessions, using very specific, suggestive techniques.
Things like hypnosis.
Hypnotic age regression, guided imagery, intense and repeated questioning. The goal was to bypass the conscious mind to get to the truth that was supposedly locked away.
And the stories that came out of these sessions, they became weirdly standardized, didn't they?
They did. As the claims got more prominent, they evolved into these incredibly elaborate narratives. And one of the most critical figures here was a psychologist named D. Corydon Hammond.
A big name in the professional hypnosis world.
A very big name. And he started publicizing this detailed, shocking theory that was drawn entirely from his patients' accounts during hypnotherapy.
So what were these accounts alleging? Because this is where it goes way beyond just abuse.
Oh, way beyond. They alleged a worldwide conspiracy. Secretive cells dedicated to ritual murder and mind control. According to his patients, the cult used sophisticated torture to intentionally create alternate personalities in victims.
Right.
So that those alters could be activated with code words. They were trained as assassins or high-end prostitutes or drug traffickers, all serving the cult's master plan.
Okay, hold on. A worldwide cult run by mind-controlled assassins. How did that get into serious professional discourse? Why wasn't that immediately flagged as, a psychotic fantasy?
That is the critical question. Hammond gave it professional legitimacy. He published this stuff in psychiatric journals. He presented it at major conferences. He even claimed the whole conspiracy was masterminded by a Jewish doctor who had worked for the Nazis but was now secretly working for the CIA to achieve world domination for a satanic cabal.
That is just unbelievable.
But because it was all packaged in the clinical language of trauma and dissociation, and backed by a professional of Hammond's stature, many in the trauma field accepted it. The International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, the ISSTD, openly promoted the idea that thousands of people were recovering real memories of SRA. The framework of trauma allowed these extraordinary claims to be treated as evidence, not symptoms.
So the institutional framework was there to validate even the wildest claims. But the panic was also about protecting kids. Which brings us to pillar two, the daycare cases.
Yes, the children's coerced allegations. This was the most public part of the panic, driven by massive media coverage, especially of the McMartin Preschool Trial,
which started in California in 1983.
And in these cases, the children's testimony, which was often gathered using these really non-standard interview techniques, became the central devastating evidence.
And the allegations themselves weren't just standard abuse claims. They stood out.
They were consistently bizarre, macabre, and very specific to the SRA narrative. In the McMartin case, kids alleged they were taken from the school, sometimes flushed down toilets into secret underground rooms. There, they supposedly witnessed or participated in rituals, orgies at car washes and airports. They even claimed to see witches fly.
And other cases were similar.
In the Fells Acres Daycare trial, children claimed they were raped with knives, sticks, forks, and even magic wands. They talked about being assaulted by clowns, being forced to eat feces and drink urine.
So it's the where there's smoke, there must be fire argument, but on a massive scale. Proponents basically said the sheer volume and specificity of these claims, the magic wands, the flying, had to be proof that this was really happening.
That was the emotional power of it. How could so many kids, interviewed separately, come up with such consistent, horrifying details if it wasn't true? The psychological pressure was immense. Which leads us to Pillar 3, the failure of physical investigations. And this is maybe the most fascinating part because it shows how a belief system can become completely airtight.
Because despite the alleged scale of this conspiracy murders, sacrifices, secret rooms investigators found nothing.
Not a thing. The McMartin investigation alone was one of the most exhaustive in U.S. history. Police searched for secret tunnels, nude photos, any kind of forensic evidence. Nothing. But proponents just skillfully use that complete lack of evidence not to question the claims, but to reinforce the conspiracy.
Which is textbook conspiracy logic. The absence of proof becomes proof of the cover-up.
Exactly. The argument was, of course you didn't find anything. The cult members are powerful. They're respectable members of society. They're perfectly organized. They make no mistakes. They clean up every single piece of evidence.
Yeah.
So the lack of proof was just interpreted as confirmation of how clever and effective the cult really was.
It's a closed circle. If you find evidence, the claims are true.
And if you find no evidence, the claims are even more true, because it proves how powerful the conspiracy is.
Okay, so this is the core of our deep dive. We're moving away from the emotionally charged testimony and into the stark reality of cognitive science. Because the entire foundation of the Satanic Panic, this idea that you can repress and then perfectly recover pristine memories, it stands or falls on our scientific understanding of how memory actually works.
And modern memory research just fundamentally contradicts how repressed memory theory was being used back then. And here we have to talk about the groundbreaking work of Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. Her research completely shifted the conversation.
Right. Subsection A, the constructive nature of memory. We like to think of memory as a video recorder, right? But Loftus showed us something much more unsettling.
Yes. The key insight is that memory isn't reproductive. It's constructive. Every single time you recall a memory, you're not just playing a file. You are actively reconstructing it. And in that moment of reconstruction, it is vulnerable to being changed.
So her work started in the lab, but moved into real-world criminal cases, showing how this happens.
It did. The foundational experiment, the car crash studies from the 70s, is a perfect example.
Let's walk through that.
Okay, so Loftus showed students videos of staged car accidents. Then she just asked them to estimate the speed of the cars. The only thing she changed was a single verb in the question, about how fast were the cars going when they verb each other.
And that tiny change in language completely altered the recalled fact.
Completely. When the question used a neutral word like collided, the average speed estimate was 32 miles per hour. When it used hit each other, it went up a little to 34. But when she used the dramatic leading verb smashed, the estimated speed jumped to 41 miles per hour.
Wow, that's almost a 10-mile-per-hour difference, just based on one word from the interviewer.
That's the core mechanism. The mind automatically incorporates that post-event information into the original memory. The word smashed contains information, the suggestion of higher speed, and the brain just integrates it into the visual memory of the accident.
And it wasn't just speed, right? It led to them remembering things that weren't there at all.
Exactly. In follow-up studies, the people who heard the word smashed were far more likely to falsely remember seeing shattered glass in the video.
Even though there was no shattered glass.
No glass at all. It demonstrates the creation of an entirely new false detail. This is often tied to what we call source monitoring errors. People remember the idea of glass, but they misattribute the source. They think they saw it, but really they just heard a suggestive word.
Which leads to the next terrifying step, implanting entire memories of events that never happened.
Right, the memory implantation studies. This is where the research got really controversial, but it was vital. Loftus and Pickrell used the now famous lost in the mall technique. They'd give subjects several true childhood stories, verified by their families, and then slip in one completely fabricated story. The fake story was about being lost in a shopping mall as a kid and being rescued by an elderly person.
And the results were pretty stark.
A remarkable 25% of the subjects later not only believed the fake story was true, but they would elaborate on it. They'd add their own vivid false details about what the rescuer was wearing or the panic they felt. They were convinced they experienced something that was entirely made up by the researcher.
And this isn't just limited to, mundane events.
Not at all. A later study found that about a third of college students accepted as true A completely false story about having their ear licked by a drug-addled Pluto character at Disneyland.
Seriously.
Seriously. The suggestion overrode their actual memory. And the more they imagined the scene, the more confident they became that it was real. That's a mechanism called imagery inflation, and it's hugely relevant here because so many of the SRA claims were generated using guided imagery and visualization in therapy.
So this science that memory is constructive and easily implanted, it takes us right to subsection B, the pitfalls of suggestive interviewing. This was the destructive engine of the daycare panic.
It was. And we have so much research, especially from Maggie Bruck and Stephen Ceci, confirming that children are uniquely vulnerable to this. Their work established that preschoolers are the most suggestible age group. And crucially, the reliability of what they say has more to do with the skill of the interviewer than any natural limit on their memory.
So let's talk about the specific methods used in the McMartin case. They're a perfect illustration of how to guarantee you'll get false claims.
Well, the social worker at the center of that investigation, Key McFarlane, used techniques that are now considered deeply flawed. Coercive, really. She used anatomically correct dolls, puppets, and highly leading questions. The interviews weren't neutral fact-finding. They were structured to reward disclosures and punish denials.
Can you give an example of that pressure?
Sure. Capes from the investigation showed one therapist telling a child that 183 other kids had already revealed yucky secrets and that the teachers were sick in the head.
Wow, think of what that does to a 4-year-old.
It's intense conformity pressure. It
Yeah.
says, everyone else is talking, your denial is wrong, and the adults you trusted are evil. You're just trying to please the nice adult who's paying attention to you.
And the research by Bruck and Ceci breaks down exactly why this creates false reports.
We can point to 3 primary mechanisms that were abused. First, just using specific or leading questions. A child's accuracy drops from about 91% with open-ended questions like, tell me what happened, down to 45% with specific questions like, did he touch you here?
Because it guides them to a conclusion, and then there's repetition.
That's the second mechanism, question repetition. When you ask a young child the same leading question over and over, they quickly figure out you didn't like their first answer, so they change it to please you. And after they've changed it, they start sounding more and more confident. The confidence isn't about the memory, it's a reflection of the interviewer's persistence.
And the most dangerous is when you combine all these things.
Yes, combining techniques. A 1998 study found that by stacking suggestive techniques, peer pressure, praise, leading questions, they could dramatically increase false claims in just one short 10-minute interview. The kids learned what types of answers the interviewer wanted to hear, and they performed. They fabricated detailed stories to satisfy the adults.
Okay, so all of this scientific deconstruction, it leads us to the final verdicts of the era. What actually happened at the end of these huge trials?
Well, the McMartin trial became a monument to failure. After 3 years of testimony, the longest criminal trial in U.S. history at the time, and costing the county over $15 million.
The result was?
No convictions, not a single one.
The 2 remaining defendants, Peggy McMartin and her son Ray Buckey, were acquitted on 52 of 65 counts. The jury deadlocked on the rest, and eventually all charges were dismissed. And Ray Buckey spent 5 years in jail waiting for that trial.
5 years. And this failure wasn't isolated. The entire concept of SRA was definitively debunked by a government investigation. A 1994 nationwide study by the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect reviewed over 12,000 documented accusations of ritual abuse.
And the conclusion?
The investigating police were not able to substantiate any allegations of organized intergenerational cult abuse.
None. Zero.
The few confirmed cases that did involve satanic claims were just lone perpetrators using the imagery to intimidate their victims. They weren't part of some global conspiracy.
So, after all the hysteria, the talk shows, the trials, the conclusion is that the bizarre claims were artifacts of the flawed investigation methods.
Absolutely. And the final piece of evidence is that once those interviewing techniques changed after McMartin, the SRA allegations just vanished.
They just disappeared from the clinical and legal landscape.
Which strongly suggests they were constructs of the investigation, not historical truths.
Okay, so we've established that the SRA phenomenon was essentially false, a moral panic, as scholars call it. But the question that has to linger for all of us is, why? Why was society so eager to believe something so incredible? And why do we see this pattern of panic keep repeating itself?
Because the belief system served a deep and, I think, uncomfortable psychological purpose. It was, in a strange way, easier to process than the mundane truth of human evil.
Let's start with the psychological comfort of denial and projection.
The SRA narrative was appealing because it allowed society to project evil onto a clear external enemy, the Satanist. And that was so much more comforting than confronting the far more common, statistically proven, and socially messy issue of incest and abuse that happens inside the home.
By family members.
By people you know and trust. SRA took the focus off that uncomfortable domestic threat and put it onto a fictional secret cabal. It gave people a sense of control. You could fight this secret enemy publicly.
And the acquittal in McMartin didn't end things. It just kicked off this huge, organized backlash against the whole idea of recovered memory, leading to the institutional backlash.
Yes. The panic directly led to the formation of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, or FMSF, in 1992. It was started by Peter and Pamela Freyd, parents who had been accused of abuse by their adult daughter. And their stated goal was to argue that these adult children weren't victims of abuse, but of bad therapy therapists implanting false memories.
And this is where it gets really nuanced, because the FMSF didn't just dismiss the satanic stuff. They took the legitimate science from people like Loftus and weaponized it against all claims of recovered memory.
They leveraged that science brilliantly. They got respected memory researchers on their advisory board, which gave them huge credibility. They aggressively advocated for accused parents. They funded lawsuits against therapists. And while they did expose some real cases of malpractice from the SRA panic, the broader effect was to create this highly polarized environment that often silenced real survivors of non-ritualistic abuse.
So they used good science to fuel a political movement that created this cloud of suspicion over all survivor testimony.
It became incredibly toxic. Believers in SRA would accuse skeptics of being anti-child or even part of the conspiracy. The polarization made any sober discussion about improving interviewing standards almost impossible, and the whole thing just resulted in a massive loss of credibility for social workers and the entire field of child protection.
And the most chilling part of all this is seeing the legacy of the Satanic Panic still with us today.
Oh, the psychological blueprint of the SRA conspiracy, the idea of powerful elites secretly harming children, it's incredibly sticky. That exact structural fear has just morphed into modern theories.
Specifically into QAnon.
QAnon adopted the SRA tropes almost perfectly. It just replaced the local daycare teachers with high-ranking political elites and Hollywood actors as the child-abusing cabal. But the core narratives is identical. A massive secret conspiracy of powerful people engaged in ritualistic and child abuse and a subsequent cover-up. The psychological comfort of projecting evil onto a clear external enemy, it's still just as potent.
The SRA panic really is one of the most powerful cautionary tales in modern history, about our legal system, about therapy, but really about the danger of combining public panic with a misunderstanding of how our own minds work.
Exactly. We've seen how critical thinking and rigorous cognitive science ultimately debunked this widespread, painful moral panic. It just proves how important it is to understand our own cognitive limits.
The entire discussion, driven by researchers like Loftus and Cece, shows us that false memories are often indistinguishable from true ones. They get embellished, more detailed over time, through suggestion and repetition. So since researchers confirm that the reliability of a child's report has more to do with the skills of the interviewer than the child's memory, and since we know these highly suggestive techniques are still devastatingly effective at fabricating detailed accounts, the question for you to ponder is this: how can our legal and psychological systems ever ensure that they are supporting the discovery of real traumatic truth without constantly falling into the devastating trap of manufacturing convincing fiction?
Thank you for joining us on Conspiracy Deconstructed for this deep exploration of memory, manipulation, and moral panic.
Until next time, stay vigilant and keep demanding facts over fear.